Hi again, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Line by Maria Schepers. Today we are moving into chapter 37, which is named Anna Müller. And of course we remember from the previous reading that Saint Germain and Cornelius, our protagonists, met with the reincarnated Martin Allais and Jean Girard, now as Guiseppe Balsamo, impersonating the Count of Cagliostro with his wife Lorenza. And at the end of the last reading, Balsamo and the wife left on not so friendly terms, but of course that did not move Saint Germain, who had merely done his duty of once again warning about a future event, giving a prophetic reading into the future. Chapter 37, Anna Müller. We started back to Kassel in the spring of 1784. I was relieved when we passed the French border. It was like getting out of an overheated room. As for Saint Germain, he was quiet and introspective. I didn't like to disturb him with questions, though I really wanted to know how long he was going to stay in Kassel. He had been so good to me that I hated to be separated from him, and not even the thought of reunion with my parents compensated for the loss. I dwelt hopefully on the idea that we were only going back to Kassel on a visit and might then go somewhere else, as his mission called him. He didn't talk about the near future, and I had been trained to curb my curiosity. Nevertheless, a link had been formed between us when I learned to obey his unspoken commands, and it transmitted my inner turmoil. He answered my questions without my having to put them into words. "Don't be uneasy about the future, Cornelius," he said. "You are at the beginning of a productive period, and I will remain for a few months to prepare you for the examinations that you, like all mortals, must face alone." When we had crossed into Kassel, we ran into a violent storm. High winds drove huge masses of water upon us. The carriage was impervious, but we turned into the nearest village inn to spare the servants and horses. Then the storm ended as quickly as it had begun, and the bright sun swept the green and pink landscape, sparkling as with diamonds. Even the puddles glistened on the ground, bright with the petals that had been blown into them. As we were leaving, a maidservant came up balancing buckets of rainwater on a pole over her shoulder. Her skirt was pinned up over pillar-like legs, muddy to the knees, and her wet, matted hair hung straight down her back. She was obviously pregnant. She looked at me with dull eyes, murmured a greeting, and went on to the squalid servants' quarters next to the pigsties. I watched her sluggish, stout figure as she stooped to enter the low wooden door. Brown water and rotting straw seeped out from under the sties, and I could see the black noses of the snuffing hogs. The very fowls in the yard looked wet and filthy. For some reason, I couldn't leave this miserable scene. Then the maidservant came back out with a feeding bowl. She glanced at me, then stopped to look more closely. She took a few uncertain steps towards me and asked if I wanted anything. "No, thank you," I replied. "I don't need anything." But then I asked her name. Anna Müller," she responded, startled. Her peasant accent was very apparent. I pushed some money into her hand and joined Saint Germain in the carriage. "Was it she?" he asked quietly when we were underway. I nodded. Corinna. Strangely, I had recognized her more quickly than in the deceptive body in which I had known her. That had been an artificial costume made by demons. Now she was unveiled, massive and ugly in her strong primitive instincts that she satisfied like an animal. She belonged in the world of evil-smelling barns, pig pens, and chicken coops. Her station as a drudge befitted her spiritual development. The dainty beauty and complex perversions had all been sloughed off in the peasant womb her drifting soul had found. All that was not a real part of her was gone. She was no longer a demonic genius. Now, Corinna was herself an ignorant and immature beggar at the beginning of her journey. I was still mulling over this illuminating meeting when I returned home to the quiet and permanent castle of Grotte. My parents did not meet me at the door. Rightly, they waited upstairs. Our relationship was not one which required emotional outbursts. I met them again in my father's dim study, tall, slender figures wearing identical smiles, and again I felt the inner warmth of deep peace and gratitude that had kindled within me the spark of the burned-out alchemist's furnace. So that was a short chapter, and we move on to chapter 38, the Coffin. My father had advanced to the highest grade of the order during my absence, and I also had progressed appreciably during the nearly 4 years I had spent with Saint Germain. I had passed the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades and begun the studies for Adeptus Exemptus. I was now familiar with the various magics and Kabbalahs and practiced many exercises of Indian and Tibetan yoga. I also learned the mystery of the secret sutras at a time when these spiritual treasures were still undiscovered by the white race. In November of 1784, we were invited to Rothenburg at a different time from our usual monthly meeting. At this time, we hadn't seen Saint Germain for a week, and our last conversation, a deep and intimate one, had left me with a strong premonition. Under his guidance, I had made out a long work program that would last me for years to come. I had sensed a farewell in his manner and something which forbade me to question. My emotional reaction could not bind him who was already free, and such feelings were also unworthy of the student. For us, change, separation, and distance were just illusions of the matter-bound personality which still suffers from such things. No matter where he went, Saint Germain was still my master and the head of my order. Karl von Hesse was one of the pillars of our order, not only because of his immense interest in the occult, but also because of his mental abilities and high ethics. He was one of the most cultured men of his age and astute enough not to scheme for political power and glory. Living modestly and contentedly, he was thankful that his desire for a secluded, introspective life accorded with the wishes of the ruling prince. Thus, he could raise his son, Victor Amadeus, born in 1779, as he wished, not as a member of an elite striving for earthly power, but as a humble novitiate of the spirit. When our carriage turned into the stone court of Rothenburg that fall afternoon, I was surprised to see a black flag fluttering at the entrance. Then I noticed that the flag on the tower was flying at half-mast, and the servants who came to meet us were in mourning. Discomfited, I had turned to question the servant when I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. He motioned me to silence, his face curiously peaceful. We walked up the long stairway until tall mirrors swathed in black. The very bouquets in the oriental vases were draped with black veils. Passing the huge silent library, we went into the hall of the order. In the center of the hall stood a coffin, covered with a funeral pall on which a single, exquisite gold rose glittered in the light of 4 surrounding candles. The coffin stood on a platform reached by 7 stairs. Only 7 candles burned in the room besides those by the catafalque. These were placed in wall brackets under 7 frescoes which Saint Germain had painted in his deep living colors. They seemed to glow with light from some hidden source. The scarlets looked like burgundy by firelight, and the greens were like the tender buds in May. The first fresco showed a padlocked gate, which an angel was trying to open. Its golden caption ran, Signatur ne perdatur. The second showed the lovely green island emerging from the sea in the clear light of sunrise and was inscribed, Aurora ab lacrimis. On the third were the 12 signs of the zodiac with the sun passing through Virgo. This one was captioned, Iam mitius ardet. The fourth showed lions, eagles, and bats warming themselves in the sun and was captioned, Non posen ibus offert. The fifth was 2 stringed instruments, one of which was being plucked by a delicate ethereal hand. Its inscription was, Unum tetigis se sat est. The sixth showed Noah's dove bearing its olive branch over an immense expanse of sky and water. Its caption ran, Emergere muntiat orbem. In the triumphant 7th fresco, a bird flew out of a nest and its inscription was, Ad sidera sursum. 3 people stood behind the catafalque. Saint Germain, wearing a long white shroud, stood in the middle with Karl von Hesse on one side and someone I had never met on the other. Yet the third man looked familiar. He was tall and powerful, brown as an Indian, and had serious eyes under his domed forehead. His thin lips were set in an expression of resignation. Since he looked amazingly like Guiseppe Balsamo, I realized this could only be the Count Cagliostro. The 2 men had been born under the same sign, Gemini, but there were quite a few centuries of development between them. Cagliostro's purified utopian being was a future state for the ignorant Balsamo, who was racked by passions and still languished in the Tower of the Dark Forces. Obviously, there was a blood relationship between them. This was indicated not only by their common birthplace and physical resemblance, but by the way their earthly fates were entwined. I later found out that Balsamo was a natural child of Cagliostro's uncle and a Sicilian peasant girl. This debauched nobleman had spawned numerous children among the peasant huts, and he cared about them quite as much as a tomcat would. Thus Balsamo could hope for no name or help from his father and had to bear his embittering secret within the very shadow of the walls of his paternal castle. He managed to fight his way out of his peasant environment, but it was easy to see how his rebellious, envious hate became the driving force in that passionate personality and why he used Cagliostro's name. Giuseppe Balsamo had hated and longed for that name which he felt to be his by right and yet had cost him so many humiliations. It had made him an outcast, neither peasant nor nobleman. Now I understood his mingled pride and shame when he had discussed his imposture with Saint Germain. But now the tall, bearded Karl von Hesse stood looking solemn and serious, and Saint Germain wore the contemplative hierophant face the world has never known. My father pulled aside the curtains of an alcove on the ground floor where there were an organ and some chairs. We went in and sat down. The curtains on the tiers of alcoves around the hall rustled, and I could feel the presence of other people. Saint Germain mounted the 7 steps and stood at the head of the coffin, his radiant face illuminated by the faint gold light. My friends and associates in the Brotherhood, that quiet, even voice filled the great hall. I have completed my mission and received the call. Now the world must hear the news of my death. I have already set our great work in motion, and the waters have begun to spring from the secret wells. Guard the source of this water and keep it pure. I have appointed a successor to be visible head of our order, but my death does not mean I shall leave the unfortunate land of the West. Certain events must take place first. You will hear news of me from time to time, and I will send you last greetings before my final departure. I will also visit personally some to whom I have something to say. But before I turn to depart on my new road, I leave you these cardinal precepts, the 11 rules of the order, the 6 duties of the order, and the 16 secret signs of the order. These 33 formulae are the very foundation of our order. The 11 rules. Love God above all else. Use your time to develop your soul. Be completely unselfish. Be sober, humble, active, and silent. Learn the origins of the metals in you. Beware of charlatans and liars. Constantly revere the highest good. Learn the theory before you try to practice. Practice charity toward all beings. Read the ancient books of wisdom. Strive to understand their secret meaning. That was the 11 rules. Here are the 6 duties. Heal the sick and relieve the suffering without thought of reward. Conform to the customs of the country in which you live. Meet with your fellow members in a preset place once a year. Select your own successor. Remember the letters RC, symbols of the Brotherhood. Keep the existence of our order secret for 100 years. Those were the 6 duties. And then the 16 secret signs. A member of the order is patient. He is compassionate. He is incapable of envy. He is not a braggart. He is not proud. He is not debauched. He is not greedy. He is not easily roused to anger. He thinks no evil of others. He loves righteousness. He loves truth. He knows how to remain silent. He believes what he has learned. His hope does not fail. He does not falter during suffering. He will always be a member of the Brotherhood. There was a great silence as he finished, while the candles cried their slow tears of wax. I could hear the soft footfalls as von Hesse and Cagliostro lifted the coffin cover to reveal the snowy lace interior. Saint Germain lay down into the coffin and clasped his hands over his chest. His eyes remained open, but already he smiled the serene, undecipherable smile of the dead. Cagliostro pulled the face cloth over him, and the 2 men replaced the lid and nailed it shut. The hammering sounded disquietingly violent in the icy stillness of the hall. Suddenly, dark clothed figures appeared and lifted the coffin to their shoulders. "Go with them, Cornelius," my father whispered. "Take a candle and follow." He himself sat down at the organ, whose deep consonances flowed over us like the silvery light of the moon. They spoke not of mourning, but of resurrection and the secret joy of recognition. I became aware of more people joining the procession. I could hear the solemn shuffle of many feet. I did not look back to see faces, but I felt a powerful current of affinity. We went through a long corridor to the chapel, with the organs pealing following us like a distant benediction. Presently it stopped, but as the crypt was opened it burst forth anew from the chapel balcony. This was a composition my father had written especially for this occasion. He never played it again. Now the coffin was laid in its deep stone bed, and the procession silently left the crypt. Saint Germain lay alone in his coffin. The iron-sheathed door rolled noiselessly back into place, and Karl von Hesse refastened it with the elaborate seal in which the letters RC glowed. We went back to the huge darkened hall, and the mute figures disappeared through the draperies one by one. My father was already waiting in our alcove, and we went out the side door together. 3 messengers were riding ahead of our carriage with a written announcement. Thus was the announcement. The Count Saint Germain, the magus and greatest wizard of all Europe, friend of emperors, poets and scientists, died at Rothenburg in the province of Kassel and was buried at the castle of Karl Emanuel von Hesse on September 7th, 1784. And thus ends chapter 38, and we will continue with yet another short chapter. Chapter 39 is called The Ghost. It was a Russian chronicler who reported Saint Germain's first appearance after his death. He reported that sometime during the winter of 1785 to 86, the Count had an important discussion with a Tsarina. The second report came from Count Charlatan, who had just returned from his assignment as ambassador to Venice. He told his friends how he had seen Saint Germain on the Piazza San Marco the evening before he left. Saint Germain had seemed youthful and alert and had laughed over the news of his own death. "He who is buried many times lives forever," he said, smiling. Then he proceeded to tell Count Charlatan the most intimate news about his family and distant relatives. His information surprised the ambassador greatly. "To tell you the truth, I didn't believe him," Count Charlatan related, "and I thought he was being unspeakably vain to use such means to get an effect. But when I got home, I found out he was telling the truth, even though changes had taken place that no outsider could readily have learned. Of course, the most interesting thing was that none of the family had talked to Saint Germain or even seen him in years." The third appearance was in 1789, 5 years after his death, to the Countess d'Adhemar, who related the incident in her memoirs, though she only told a little about their conversation. It occurred again in the Recollets church during the morning mass. Suddenly she saw Saint Germain's dark-clothed figure beside her. He gave her a friendly nod. "His presence was so natural and serene," the Countess wrote, "that I was not the least bit frightened. It was just like continuing a conversation that had been interrupted the moment before. He spoke and I answered like a sleepwalker, though I was more intensely aware of my surroundings than I have ever been." "Then the news of your death was false," I said joyfully. "I should have known." "To the world, the news is true, madame," he replied gently. "But those who do not believe in death know that all such news is basically erroneous." "I can't thank you enough for the hope you've given an old woman heading for the grave. Thank God I can see you again. You know, my faith is as weak as my character, and I am prey to destructive doubts. I'm afraid to die and long for certainty, but I always kill the most soothing arguments with the poison of doubt. I dread the thought of annihilation in the cold, frozen darkness. My elements are heat, light, and motion. My body is a disobedient wreck. But my soul is alive with curiosity and energy." "You will live many times, madame," he responded, "simply because you wish to live. Your soul is a vigorous young tree. The state of your body is only in autumn. Who can say the tree is dead when winter comes? Many new springs will bring it buds and flowers, and many summers will bring it thick foliage and fruit." "I wished our conversation could have lasted forever," the Countess related. "After Mass, I asked him to see me to my coach. He took my arm to support me, for my legs were weak and arthritic. Once we got outside, I noticed how young and healthy he looked. His arm was like steel beneath mine, and he walked with a springy step. When he saw how I clung to him, he got into the coach and drove home with me. We drove slowly, and I even told the coachman to make a detour just so I could talk to him a little longer. There were so many things to talk about. I told him how all his predictions about the Queen were proving horribly true. Marie Antoinette stands alone within an icy cordon of enemies, even though she has matured a great deal since the birth of her 4 children. I told him that she could really be a good mother and queen if time would only allow it. She sees her danger now and is trying desperately to make amends, but no one will believe her. Then, We discussed other matters, strange things that exalted me and strengthened my faith, but I promised Saint Germain I would write nothing of these. It was with a regretful but renewed soul that I bade farewell to this brilliant man whom all believed to be dead. To me, everyone else was dead and lifeless in comparison. Saint Germain appeared again to the Princess de Lamballe as she was being torn to pieces. He also stood beside Jeanne du Barry at her execution, a noble reserved figure amidst the screaming mob. These details come from Grosley, who also tells how Saint Germain disappeared from prison. During the terror, he wrote, the police arrested a foreigner who was always present at the executions and showed a marked sympathy for the victims. Saint Germain, for it was he, went with them without resistance. He found a great many friends and acquaintances among the captive nobles and strengthened them by his calm and tranquility. When he was speaking, Grosley related, the horror of death vanished from their faces like snow under the spring sun. His name was on the list to be executed, and he even lined up with the others, but he was not there when they got on the tumbrel. The guards didn't notice his disappearance until they were making their tallies at the end of the day, when they all ran around shouting. But that whole day he had stood by the guillotine, the chronicler added, a tall, calm figure amidst the raging mob. His face was the last thing seen by the condemned, and his smile lingered on theirs. A smile of serenity on bloody, severed heads. And that is the end of chapter 39, and we'll end this reading with that. And for chapter 40, we will go on another chapter of our protagonist's, Cornelius's, spiritual adventure, and the chapter is called A Kilcore. See you there. Thank you.